Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Creating Space podcast. My name is Olivia Lancashire, and as an extension of my undergraduate research with the Lumen Prize at Elon University, I'll be conducting a series of interviews exploring purity culture and its connections to patriarchy and relationship violence. Throughout this series, I'll be speaking with individuals from a range of backgrounds and areas of expertise. In doing so, I hope to create a space for questions and conversations that many people are too afraid to talk about. Today, I'm excited to welcome Dr. Victoria Hauser to the podcast. Dr. Hauser is an assistant teaching professor in the writing program at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She earned her PhD from Clemson University in 2021, where her dissertation, Altered Bodies, Evangelical Purity Rhetorics, and the Age of Sexual Politics, examines the intersections of purity culture and contemporary gender discourse. Her research and writing focus on evangelical purity culture, a passion that grew from her own experiences being raised within a religious cult tied to the purity movement. More broadly, her work engages with cultural and feminist rhetorics, with a focus on gender, sexuality, reproductive justice, and trauma. With that, I'm so excited to begin our conversation. Welcome, Dr. Hauser, to the podcast. So to get started, my first question is, for those who might be unfamiliar, can you just talk a little bit about what purity culture is from your perspective?
Yeah, a lot of people who are doing work with purity culture, we continue to define it and update it and think about what it means in our current political climate. So it's an always evolving definition, I guess I would say. Essentially, purity culture is something that extends far back beyond the 1990s, early 2000s movement, but it is most popularized by the abstinence-only education movement. And so a lot of people are very familiar with like the true love waits and silver ring thing. Those are definitely elements of purity culture, like the more popularized versions of it, the kind where you saw celebrities like Miley Cyrus wearing purity culture rings and that kind of thing. But it really is more about the ideological and theological underpinnings that suggest that we strive in all areas of our lives to maintain a kind of purity that is both about abstaining from sex, but also about being in a certain kind of relationship with God and our communities, often one that is very restrictive, one that denies a lot of room for sexual pleasure, sexual experience, and creates systems of shame and guilt.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I'm curious in your experience, because I know that a lot of your work was informed by some of your personal experiences. Can you talk about kind of what purity culture sounded like or felt like when you were in the church environment?
Yeah, all of my work is really from my lived experience with purity culture, which is an interesting position to occupy because it's something that I look back on those experiences from where I am now, and it's a very different kind of felt affective memory, right? And so, but when I think back to those spaces, a lot of it really felt like these having like a clear set of instructions. Like some of it felt really good and felt very empowering to have like simple directions for how to achieve healthy marriages and how to achieve like the quote unquote good life under the banner of evangelical Christianity, of course. And so it often did give this outlet to something that I really strove for, which is connected to some other elements about, being raised inside of a religious cult, et cetera. But, I don't know if I really understood how harmful the impacts of it were until after I was outside of it, right? But the feelings from within were I had a lot of validation from the group for performing purity, and that always felt very comforting in some ways. So there wasn't like at the time when I was in high school, there weren't necessarily a lot of negative effects of purity of purity culture and its teachings, other than the ways that now looking back as an adult, I can see it did it caused a lot of other damage in my life, right? Like there's a lot to be said about emotional literacy and relational literacy that you're foregoing when you're inside these spaces where you're just abstaining from any sort of interaction with people that might be considered flirty or whatever, right? So it was a highly restricted community, but at the time it didn't necessarily feel like I was missing out on anything until I was able to kind of step back and look at the broader picture of it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it made me think of, I know, sometimes people will like seek out religious communities and these types of teachings because it feels safe and it almost provides like a sense of control. And I think I remember reading somewhere that when individuals grow up in maybe a more chaotic environment or come from families of divorce or whatever it might be, I think religion can provide like a backbone of sorts of structure and like safety. And so I think it's interesting that a lot of the times what's bringing people in is then in turn actually doing the opposite and perhaps um, hurting people and causing trauma. So I'm wondering, we know that purity culture impacts people within the church, and I'm wondering if you have noticed if purity culture impacts and infiltrates others even outside of religious systems.
Yeah, this is an interesting question for many reasons, because it is in so many ways we have to look at how purity culture was formed. And Sarah Mosner's work on this is really important, I think, as well as others. But Sarah does a ton of research on the history of purity culture and its connections to things like racism and race and gender and sexuality, right? All these things that are wrapped up in how we understand the concept of purity as humans. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge that purity culture didn't just like spring out of evangelical 1990s, early 2000s evangelical Christianity in a way that was like totally new and sexy and exciting, right? Even though that is very much how it was framed. But there's this really long history and even something in our, I think, inside of our humanity that kind of longs for this idealized version of what it means to be pure, what it means to be clean, what it means to be, sanctified or whatever, right? And that does really impact other social systems in a way that purity culture, I think, kind of manifested a lot of. It manifested in a way that was pretty harmful, but it manifested in a way that was also really connected to other systems of harm already, which is, I think, what made it so powerful and so present, and why it's something we're still really grappling with, because it's not like we all decided, okay, well, purity culture wasn't working, so never mind. Like it has these kind of lingering effects. And so especially the ways that we think about gender and sexuality and race, purity is very much wrapped up in all of those things. And I would put class in there as well, that like who has access to performing purity in a specific way usually does require some level of affluence. And so there's a lot of harm, I think, that is still circulated by these teachings and by the way that we understand purity, but I don't think it's separate from things that were already present and will remain present for a while.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And that kind of leads into the next question, which is, what connections have you noticed between purity culture, patriarchy, and relationship violence?
So I think the biggest one for this, the most obvious one that we're always wrestling with, is the way that gender was constructed and is constructed within purity culture. So you have people like Leslie Ludy writing books for young women that tell them how to be chaste. And specifically in The Lost Art of True Beauty, she writes a lot about this. It's basically a manuscript, but I want to say like a step-by-step manual for how to perform purity as a young woman. But when you start to look at those steps, a lot of them are about, making sure that you are protecting men's sexuality and not putting a stumbling block there for them. You don't want to tempt them by how you dress or how you act or how you talk. And so there's so much self-surveillance built into that, that's like directly being taught to young women. Or I should also would like to say as a caveat that a lot of purity culture is very much built around heterosexist ideas, very binary, very much directed at gender in that way. So that's an important thing to consider as well. Like it does uphold systems of rape culture that have been around for a while, but I think it's reinforced by these very kind of dominant ideologies that show up in purity culture, that women are supposed to be submissive and that it's expected that men are going to want to act out and be aggressive. And so if you give them any sort of reason to do that, there's a direct quote from Leslie Ludy's book where she says, if you dress and act like, somebody who is sexually promiscuous, then you can't blame a man for treating you as a sex object. And that's obviously quite dangerous, right? Like that, logic breaks down really quickly when you start to think about victims of sexual abuse and patriarchy and relationship violence, all those things that are built into how one might interpret sexual violence when it happens to them. There's, no matter what you're wearing, there's always going to be this question about was I to blame, right? And so that aspect of it, I think, is maybe the most harmful and the most restrictive. And then the other side with gender and the way it's inscribed in purity culture is, of course, thinking about masculinity, toxic masculinity. And that's a work that I've really been focused on more recently, is looking at the messages that were directed at young men, young boys who were growing up inside the system as well, and the ways that it taught them, really reinforced a lot of things we know to be true about patriarchy, like stoicism at the heart of it, aggression, etc. You're not supposed to feel weak. Your job as a man is to protect your family and make sure that your wife obeys you and stuff like that, and to lead your wife and all of these things. And I think that a lot of the harm done to men inside those spaces is also, it looks exactly like what we know patriarchy to look like. That when men are taught not to feel things, they end up repressing a lot of those feelings, and it comes out as anger or other things that are less maybe even worse than anger. So yeah, there's a lot built into that system of sexual violence that is reinforced by the norms of purity culture, but particularly the way gender is inscribed.
Yeah. Wow, this is all so fascinating to me. I just read A Will to Change by Bell Hooks, and so the idea of men being just as affected by patriarchy is so interesting. And when I was reading it, I really did see the connection between purity culture and patriarchy, and how it just continues to reinforce the message that men have a certain role, women play another role. And like you said, I feel like it kind of places the responsibility on women, but then also removes the opportunity for men to express perhaps the full version of who they are. And yeah, I can see that being really damaging.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said about The Will to Change by Bell Hooks is a fantastic book. And I do think there's something to be said about the ways that those gender roles are very much formed around the main message of purity culture, is that if you perform it well enough, if you are able to perform purity in a particular fashion, that you will eventually arrive at this happy marriage with a submissive wife and happy kids and affluence and social acceptance, right? It promises all these things to the participants, but more often than not, it actually precludes the opportunity to have those things. Because so look at this, particularly the way it's taught to men, and that idea, right? And Bell Hooks does such a beautiful job at discussing the ways that patriarchy really is also quite harmful for men. But that particular element, there's such little room for emotional and sexual literacy to develop within relationships at a young age, in your early 20s. I mean, up until marriage, right? You're expected to not engage in any sort of relationship that might be intimate in a way that would break the purity culture script. But then you're foregoing that literacy, that experience that you really need, so that when you get into a marriage, you have no tools for dealing with conflict, for dealing with connection, or if you have, or talking about intimacy, or talking about desire and exploring that with a partner. You don't have any sort of experiential knowledge with that, nor do you really have any sort of knowledge from other spaces, because the only thing that you're really consuming is this way to not do those things. And so I think in a lot of ways, it's this paradox where you end up being told you're going to get into this marriage if you follow these rules that will be really happy. But then people end up in these marriages where they're not even sure how to navigate their desire, or what that even means, right? And or how to have conversations with their partners about those things. And that's quite the opposite of what was promised in purity culture, right? So anyway, I think that's also kind of built into when we think about relationship violence. That's a part of it too, is that when people don't have the tools to discuss intimacy and connection, and they don't have that kind of emotional maturity to do those things, what happens inside the context of their intimate relationships?
Right. That's such a good point. And I think it's interesting because I remember growing up in my own Christian context and hearing like marriage or sex can only happen within the marriage. But my thought was always, well, once you get married, then what? Like, is that pure now? And like, how do you go about that and not feel guilty when all these years you've been told, feel guilty, feel guilty? So I feel like it's almost like your brain wires to associate sex with bad and sex with guilt. And yeah.
Absolutely, yes. And it's there's so much that we could say about that too. I think that will come up in some of these other questions as well, because it's one of the more insidious parts of purity culture, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, okay, so for context, in my last research project, I was looking a lot at different perspectives of hell within Christianity and how that could lead to religious trauma. And I'm curious if you've noticed that if the doctrine of hell kind of impacts purity culture rhetoric and if it perhaps like amplifies people's experiences within purity culture.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. I have not done research on that particular element of it myself. And it's also not something, I think in a lot of ways as a kid in my own personal experiences, I had accepted or not accepted this concept of hell. Like it just didn't really occupy my thoughts or much of my life at all in ways that I know it did for other people. And I don't really know why that is, right? I think some things really land in the context of our family systems and everything else that shapes who we are, and then others don't. And so I was really, I think, in some ways, just it's a gift that I wasn't that obsessed with hell as a small child. But I do
Yeah.
think that there's a lot of research out there on this kind of thing, and you have done a lot of that research yourself, and so. From my perspective, I don't really have too much personal experience on that particular area. Um, but certainly, the ways that like sin is wrapped up in the idea of premarital sex and all of that, certainly, I'm sure, gives some sort of charge to purity culture in a way that can be really toxic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know at the beginning you mentioned like purity is really like put on a pedestal, I guess, or like pure is kind of what will give you this perfect life. And so I can imagine that when sexuality is kind of placed above other things like gossip or lying, it kind of becomes more at the forefront of people's minds, maybe when thinking about like, how can I get to heaven and how can I do this right? Which can also lead to a lot of dichotomous thinking and feeling like things have to be a certain way.
Yeah, and I guess the one thing I'll just maybe add to that is this idea, the idea of hell and the way it's wrapped up in evangelicalism is really fascinating, but it's similarly mapped onto purity culture in that exact way, where like if you do these things, you'll arrive at X, right? You'll get the rewards of having followed the script you were given. But then it keeps us from living our lives, right? And I do think in a lot of ways there's this idea of hell and heaven that is situated as something we're working toward, but
Right.
it precludes the opportunity then to be alive in our bodies and to celebrate our bodies and to feel everything we feel in our bodies as in the kind of present that we live in, that we're not living towards some sort of possible future in heaven, but that we get to just be alive in our bodies now, I think is a beautiful thing. But of course, that's a big part of the heaven hell discourse.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. And I think that kind of, I think we'll maybe touch on in the next question. But thinking about impacts of purity culture, I can imagine that when people are told, like, don't feel, repress whatever sexual desire it is you have, I'm sure it can lead to a lot of disassociation and being out of the body. And I'd love for you to speak on that. I know you write a lot about those like embodied practices, and I think it's so interesting. So I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, so I will say too here, I'm currently training to get certified as a trauma recovery coach to do work on this with clients, and I'm starting to practice myself to do that kind of work with one-on-one with individuals and inside a workshop. And so it has taken up a large part of what I focus on now in terms of embodiment and what it means to be alive in our bodies and the joy and beauty involved in all of that. And so I do think more often than not, when I talk to people about purity culture, that is the thing that comes up the most is the ways. And similar, we can go back to this other point that you made too, that when it comes to sex and sexuality and sexual desire and intimacy, when the association with that is shame and guilt for, the majority of your adolescent life, when you get into these spaces where you're, finally allowed to do it, um, there's very little knowledge about what you actually want. So there's one of my favorite things to bring up from the purity culture books. In Every Young Woman's Battle, there's this chapter that deals with they don't call it masturbation, they call it fueling your own fire, which is an interesting way to frame it. But they specifically, the authors of that book said that you should never, this is written to young women, you should never explore your own pleasure. You should never touch yourself, basically. Because if you figure out what you like, then you're not going to be satisfied you're not going to want to have sex with your husband because you're not going to be satisfied by it. And I think it's an interesting thing to go to assume, because it's so normalized that women inside of heterosexual relationships particularly in the context of purity culture and this norm of evangelical Christianity, is that your role is to please your husband and your sexuality doesn't matter as much. And so then built into this context of shame and guilt that one would feel about having sex in the first place, there are so many people who struggle with it inside of their marriages. And I think that's one of the biggest impacts, is that and there's a lot of anger around that, but one of the biggest impacts is that you're really kind of there's a big negative outcome on your own sexual exploration if you don't even have the tools or understanding of your own body, right? And so you think about sex education even, and the ways that our bodies work, there's such little knowledge about that. And I'm always surprised and try to never shame people for the things that they don't know about their bodies in their 30s and 40s, right? It's a very interesting and difficult and painful experience to have to work through all of these things that you just did not even have the opportunity to explore as an adolescent.
Yeah, I think that made me think of too, with abstinence only education, there's usually no conversation around boundaries and consent. And so that just kind of perpetuates relationship violence too within those systems, because you're never taught how to express, what do I need, when say no.
Yeah, and built into that, so what counts as consent, and that consent is ongoing. There's so little there's so little exploration of that even understanding your experiences as something that might not have been consensual, and even inside of a marriage, right? Marital rape is something that we don't talk about enough in society, but it does happen. And I think in these particular contexts, it creates incredibly unsafe environments for people inside relationships who don't have that kind of relational literacy, or even literacy about consent and all of that. And so I do think there's so many different things that we could talk about when it comes to sexual violence and purity culture, and a lot of that is also built up into these intimate relationships where we have violence between violence within intimate relationships, right?
Yeah, and that's also just made me think of, I think if I'm remembering correctly, marital rape was not even made illegal until I think 1940 or 1980, something like that. Which is wild to think about, and kind of like you were saying at the beginning, goes back to this long history of purity even outside of evangelicalism.
Yes. Yeah. It's the more you look at it, the more unsettling it is, right? And the harder it is to deny the connections to some of these other social and cultural norms that we have.
Right. And it's sad too, because I think for me, I've recently kind of been thinking through and moving away from some of those spaces. And I think a lot of the rhetoric currently is like talking about biblical marriage and what it means to like be a woman within that context. And it's interesting because when I started to look at the historical context, I was kind of like, what is a biblical marriage really? Because at the time when this text was being written, women didn't have rights and women were property, and women, I mean girls really, were being sold. So it's just interesting to think about how we talk about it now apart from the actual context that the text was written.
Yeah. I don't know if you've read Biblical Manhood by John Piper, and I can't remember who the other co-author is on that book. It's not something that I like sit down and read lightly. But I have read it as something for my research recently. And it's very difficult to deny the harm caused by some of those just accepted tropes about what it means to be inside godly marriages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I think kind of moving away from some of these impacts, what would you say for those who are recovering from purity culture or moving away from it? What kind of modes of healing or integration have you found to be helpful or would you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, so this is so interesting now that I'm doing this work as a trauma recovery coach. Like, I do see so much benefit in my own life from having done trauma therapy and trauma recovery work myself. And even just, I think one of the bigger, so this is connected back into this question about the impacts. When we don't have relational literacy, or even we haven't been taught how to regulate our nervous systems, and we are dealing with trauma, often we're dealing with a dysregulated nervous system, and which leads to things like dissociation and all kinds of other trauma responses to things. And so I think in this sense, to even acknowledge, starting with this place of acknowledging and naming what you have experienced, and identifying parts where parts that were traumatic, or parts that, or maybe how the whole story itself is in some ways complex, or a complex form of PTSD, right? What we would call CPTSD. And a lot of that involves things like emotional neglect, emotional abuse, manipulation, all of that. And so when we think about our bodies and the way our bodies hold our stories and our experiences, coming back into that, I think, is the biggest and maybe most important part about our healing from purity culture, is learning, or not even learning, but just letting ourselves exist inside of our bodies in ways that are healing for us. And so some of that does really look like you need co-regulation with another person, and you need examples of and somebody I really did need somebody to walk with me through what it meant to ground myself and what it meant to regulate my emotional systems. And there were so many, we're not always going to get it right. More often than not, we're going to get it wrong. And I think this is another really big part of purity culture, the idea of perfection, right? That you have to always be the perfect wife. You have to be the perfect daughter. You have to be the perfect woman. You have to be the perfect person, right? And you have to be obliging and kind and caring and submissive and all these things all of the time. And there's a very clear path to this idea of being perfect, that we're also not then allowed to make mistakes. But our relationships, of course, involve things like being allowed to make mistakes. And I think learning how to emotionally regulate ourselves so that we can relate with others is such an important part of all of this. And to know when we've caused harm and how to accept that and how to own it and move on and heal is an important part of all of this too. But there's so much shame built into the system itself that I think we often, it's easier, or maybe not easier, but uh, we're taught in a lot of ways to avoid dealing with those things. And then we are left with like a much larger problem of dissociation. So anyway, all that is to say, I do think like there's lots out there, and lots of resources, lots of ways for people to enter into that work, but there also has to be a desire for that, right? You can't ever start that journey or start that process until you're in a place where you're really hungry for it or searching for it yourself, right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I love what you said about being able to kind of name when you've caused harm too, because I think within the system, it's whenever you do something quote unquote sinful, it's really ingrained in people to kind of hide that because there's consequences both eternally but also within the church community. And I think that can be so hard once you are moving away from that because you've been taught that conflict and hard conversations are to be avoided and that you are a bad person if you do X, Y, and Z. And I think it's interesting because it's never overtly stated that that's true, but then covertly, I think the community treats sin and these things as really problematic. And I think the communities can end up kind of shunning people that have caused harm, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, I think that's one of the harder things to confront about purity culture is the ways that we're all kind of implicated in the system of complicity built into that, into systems that would teach people to hide sexual abuse that they know about because they're afraid of looking bad or afraid of airing their dirty laundry to the world, and the church has to look perfect, right? And we can't ever have mistakes or sin inside of our congregation. But when that sin is something like sexual violence and sexual abuse that is being um, perpetuated within the community, it has to be addressed, right? I can't.
Mhm.
So yeah, in any case, I do think there's a lot of ways that we um, have to grapple with with our positionality inside that system of harm.
Yeah, 100%. And then I know at the beginning you mentioned that at some points for you, purity culture in a way felt good because it came with the validation of the community and just like belonging, maybe. I'm wondering for those leaving that community, like how, or I guess, what would you recommend to kind of rebuild that part of their lives when you maybe lose what was once belonging for you?
Yes, as I'm chuckling a little bit at this question, just because I think about my journey out, and I left purity culture. I really left evangelicalism in my mid-20s and early. I left purity culture. I really kind of put that to the side but it was a very painful process. And then when I really left evangelicalism in my mid-20s, I always say that I did that so that I could keep God, and I still mean that. And I think about that all of the time about what does God mean to us, and how as a word it kind of brings up a lot of different things. Like as a term, it evokes a lot, but thinking about what it means to love each other and what it means to be in community with each other, I think is kind of wrapped up in that question about our spiritual practice, about our spiritual, for people who are inside of those spaces and value their own, like their spiritual practices. How do you kind of hold on to those things? And I was really fortunate when I left. I had a strong community of people outside of Christianity already. And that did make it so much easier for me to just kind of say, perhaps not, like
Yeah.
maybe I'm done doing this thing. And there was a breaking point for me. And I don't think that's always the case with people. And there was something where I was like, I can't do this any longer. And a lot of that had to do with bigotry inside of the church. And I was just like, I can't stay. I was at a point where I could no longer really make excuses for it, and for the way that system worked. And so I left. But I don't know that everybody has such a clear kind of moment or a break. It's often these little things over time that where we start to question, is there something else? Is there something outside of this? Is there something that, in what ways does this maybe limit how I engage with God? And I remember I started there with this, like, I think that God is so much bigger than the Bible even, right? And like, you can't go around just saying that inside
Yeah.
churches. Uh,
Yeah.
I mean, you can, and I did, but I was not very well received inside those spaces for saying such things.
Yeah.
And so, I think in our journeys out, such an important part of that is connection to yourself first and really kind of thinking about or sitting with, what does it mean, these bigger questions, what does it mean for me to give love and care to myself? And especially when you are taught that that is a selfish thing to do and that it's ungodly and that you should be placing all of your energies outward, taking that season of really looking inward and looking at, who am I? Who do I want to become? How do I want to become that person? What does it mean to be inside relationship? What do I want out of relationships? What do I bring to relationships? How do I connect with people? But how do I kind of give myself the love that I need? And how does that, interact with my understanding and relationship to God and whatever that might mean? There's lots of questions I think that we can ask. But coming back to like yourself as this center is a really tricky thing to do when you've been taught your whole life that you shouldn't trust yourself and that you shouldn't, be looking inward. You should be looking outward. And so, yeah, I wish that there was an easy answer to say like, okay, well, when you leave this community, it is going to be very, very hard. All you have to do is just join a graduate program. That's why I was struggling earlier. It's like, don't go to grad school. I mean, unless you really want to go to grad school. But I mean, that was the space that I found myself in, was like, I had this community within graduate school that did make it a little bit easier for me to walk away from it, because I also sometimes joke that I left one cult to join another, but I can't get into the cult academia. Anyway, so there's a lot there that I think there's not an easy answer to. There's not this like, as long as you just start maybe going to yoga classes, then you'll meet friends and everything will be fine, right? Like, although going to yoga classes might be a really nice thing to do for yourself, and it might be a really nice way to meet friends, there's not really an easy solution to it, especially while you're dealing with this sense of loss and grieving what you had inside of that community. I think just allowing some space in your life to do that, because it often also means, restructuring or losing relationships that are really important to you. And it's possible, but it requires so much of us. And so my biggest recommendation is that people give themselves grace and let themselves like sit with the harder stuff and acknowledge that it is going to take time. It's a huge process. It's a big learning curve, and you don't have to do it alone. There are people like me and other coaches doing this kind of work that is the goal, is to sit with people in that process and walk with them through it. And so there's lots of ways I think to do that, but there's not like an easy path forward.
Yeah. I resonate a lot with everything you just said. And I think that when you were talking about kind of reimagining what God means to you and thinking beyond the maybe limiting version that you were given for a long time is so powerful. And I found that to be really meaningful for me in my journey, because I think, what we were initially given perhaps served a purpose, but I think moving beyond that and asking yourself and checking in with yourself about like what really resonates with this idea in me is such an important question, and I think speaks to a lot of what you talk about with coming back to yourself and coming back to your body. And I think, it's just really powerful work. So I love everything that you're writing about and doing, and I really appreciate all of it.
Thank you. Yeah, it is a long process, right? And it's something now, several years removed for myself, I can look back and say, man, I had so much to figure out. I made a lot of mistakes, and I don't ever, I as much as we can, I try to allow a lot of grace in my life for these versions of myself that were growing and the ways that I'm continuing to grow, right? Like, we're always becoming ourselves. And I think that's a large part of this journey, is, letting yourself enter into that space that you're transforming. And it's going to be hard and you're going to make mistakes. But it is really worth it in the end, I think.
Yeah, totally. Well, that concludes all of our questions today, but thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. This was fantastic. Thank you for such thoughtful questions.